thought it
Welcome
went
back
well.
to the life
It
with
was
the
actually
Browns a
kinda
father.
cool to know.
It's a word that sounds simple,
up with this
but carries
idea
a weight
that she
most
wanted
people never stop to define. Because a father is not just biology. It is not just a name written on paper or a title passed down through DNA. A father, in the real sense of the word, is the man who shows up. The man who stays. The man who protects, provides, and emotionally anchors a child through every stage of becoming. And so the question has to be asked without hesitation, without softening the edges, without excuses. When you strip everything else away, when you remove the cameras, the confessionals, the edited narratives, and the public image, who has actually fulfilled that role in truly Brown's life? Because biology gave her one answer, but life, as it so often does, gave her a completely different one. To understand this story, you cannot start in the middle. You have to go back to the foundation, back to the world Truly was born into. A world shaped by plural marriage, shifting households, emotional complexity, and a father who was never fully in one place long enough to be fully present in any of them. Kody Brown built a life that was always divided. Multiple homes, multiple wives, multiple sets of children, all competing for one man's time, attention, and emotional energy. And in theory, it was supposed to work as a unified family system. In reality, it created fragmentation. Quiet gaps where presence should have been. Emotional distance where consistency should have lived. And in the middle of that structure was Truly Brown, the youngest child of Kody Brown, the baby of her household. A child born into a family that was already stretched across emotional and physical distances. On the surface, Truly had everything that looks like stability from the outside: siblings, parents, a televised family legacy, and a household connected to one of reality TV's most recognizable names. But what the cameras never fully captured was the slow shift happening underneath it all. Kody Brown herself would later describe something that changed the entire understanding of this family dynamic. She said she felt like a single mother long before the marriage officially ended. Not as a dramatic statement, not as an accusation, but as a lived reality that stretched across years. And that one admission changes everything about how you view Truly's childhood. Because if Kody was functioning alone emotionally, if she was carrying the weight of parenting without consistent partnership, then what was Truly actually experiencing as a child growing up inside that environment? Children do not interpret absence the way adults do. They don't have the language for it. They don't analyze emotional availability or relational imbalance. They feel it. In behavior. In tone. In consistency. In who shows up and who doesn't. And slowly, over time, those patterns become the child's normal. Truly Brown grew up inside that normal. A world where her father existed, but not always in a way that felt steady. A world where attention was divided, priorities shifted, and emotional availability was inconsistent at best. And without anyone needing to say it out loud, a question began forming underneath the surface of her story. A question that would not fully reveal itself until much later. What does a real father actually look like? When Kody Brown later admitted that she felt like a single mother for years before the marriage officially ended, it didn't land like a dramatic confession. It landed like something quieter, more final. The kind of truth that doesn't need embellishment because it is already heavy enough on its own. And if you really sit with that statement, it reframes everything. Because feeling like a single mother doesn't just describe workload. It describes emotional reality. It describes nights where decisions are made alone. Days where support is assumed but not actually present. Moments where a child looks to both parents, but only one consistently responds. Kody wasn't speaking about a temporary imbalance. She was describing a pattern that stretched across years of family life, across multiple homes, across shifting dynamics that never fully stabilized. And in that environment, Truly Brown was growing up. Not in isolation, not without love, but in a system where presence was inconsistent enough that it shaped how stability itself was understood. Kody Brown was not absent in the literal sense. That is important to clarify. He was present in a structural sense, appearing across households, appearing in moments, appearing on camera. But presence and consistency are not the same thing. A child doesn't measure a father by appearances. A child measures him by repetition, by reliability, by emotional predictability. Who shows up when things are hard? Who stays when things are ordinary? Who is there when no cameras are rolling? Over time, those questions define the emotional architecture of childhood. And for Truly, the answers were becoming increasingly uneven. As the Brown family expanded and fractured across multiple homes, attention naturally followed the path of least resistance. Newer relationships demanded energy. Newer households became focal points. Newer dynamics required management. And in that redistribution of emotional labor, some children inevitably experienced less of what they needed most: steady, uncomplicated attention. That's where the subtle shift begins. Not in one dramatic moment, not in a single betrayal, but in accumulation, missed time, divided focus, emotional fatigue, competing priorities, and a child who learns, without ever being told directly, that love exists, but access to it is inconsistent. Christine carried most of the visible burden of that inconsistency. She became the stable center in Truly's day-to-day life, the parent who didn't rotate in and out, the one who didn't require scheduling around other households, the one who was there when the structure around them wasn't. That distinction matters more than it sounds, because children don't just remember who loves them, they remember who is available to them. And slowly, availability becomes attachment. Attachment becomes trust. And trust becomes identity. So while the outside world saw a large, functioning family unit, the internal experience was far more fragmented. Not broken in a single dramatic collapse, but stretched thin across time until emotional certainty became something a child could not reliably count on from both parents equally. And that is where the real foundation of Truly Brown's story begins to take shape. Not in what was said to her, but in what was consistently shown. As time passed, the structure of the Brown family didn't just stretch, it started to redistribute itself in ways that quietly reshaped every child's emotional experience, especially the younger ones like Truly. On paper, nothing about Kody Brown's role changed overnight. He was still the father. He was still present in the family system. He still moved between households, still appeared in shared moments, still occupied the central figure he had always been in the narrative of the family. But childhood doesn't operate on paper. It operates on patterns. And the pattern that began to emerge was subtle, but consistent. Attention was no longer evenly felt across all homes. Some households became emotionally louder. Some relationships required more immediate energy. Some dynamics carried more urgency. And in that shifting attention economy, the quieter corners of the family started to feel the difference first. Truly Brown was growing up in one of those corners. Not abandoned, not forgotten, but increasingly positioned in a space where access to her father required navigation, timing, and circumstances aligning in the right way. And for a child, that difference is everything. Because a father who is there sometimes does not feel the same as a father who is there always. Over time, that inconsistency becomes familiar. And familiarity, in a child's mind, becomes normality. But normality is not the same as security. Christine Brown, meanwhile, continued to anchor the daily emotional structure of Truly's life. She became the constant point of reference, the person who didn't rotate in and out, the one who handled the routines, the emotional fluctuations, the everyday decisions that shape a child's sense of stability. And without needing to announce it, a quiet imbalance formed. One parent became the foundation. The other became the variable. This is where perception begins to split from intention. Because Kody Brown likely did not see himself as absent. In his own framing, he was managing a complex family system, trying to maintain relationships across multiple homes, multiple children, and multiple responsibilities. But intention does not erase impact. And impact, especially on a child, is measured in consistency. What Truly experienced was not a dramatic absence, but a gradual emotional distancing. Moments that didn't align. Time that didn't fully overlap. Conversations that didn't always happen when needed most. A sense that connection existed, but not in a way that could be reliably depended on. And children are remarkably sensitive to that kind of shift. They notice who asks questions first, who follows up later, who remembers details, who needs reminders. And without anyone explicitly teaching it, they begin to form emotional hierarchies of trust. At the top is the person who is always there. Below that, the person who is sometimes there. And below that, the emotional uncertainty that comes with not knowing which version of someone you will get on any given day. That is how distance forms in a child's mind long before any adult realizes it has happened. And for Truly, that distance was quietly becoming part of her emotional baseline. Not loud, not dramatic, but present enough to shape how she understood reliability itself. And that understanding would matter more later than anyone could have predicted. As the Brown family continued to evolve, a new layer entered the dynamic that would quietly intensify the emotional imbalance already forming across the households. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't announced. It unfolded gradually through priorities that shifted, attention that narrowed, and emotional energy that began to concentrate in fewer places than before. The introduction of Robin Brown into the core structure of Kody's life didn't just add another relationship, it reconfigured the entire emotional economy of the family system. And when that happens in a plural family setup, nothing stays evenly distributed for long. Time, attention, and emotional presence are finite resources. And children notice where those resources flow. From the outside, the family was still presented as unified. The idea of one interconnected household system remained part of the public narrative. But internally, the lived experience was becoming more segmented. Certain relationships required more maintenance. Certain emotional bonds became more central. Certain households began to feel more prioritized in ways that were not always explicitly stated, but deeply felt. And in any family, especially one with children as observant as Truly Brown, perception forms faster than explanation. Truly was still young during this period, but not too young to register patterns. Children don't need full understanding to recognize consistency. They don't need adult language to feel emotional availability shifting around them. They notice who gets the longer conversations, who gets the calmer responses, who gets the more patient version of the same person. And over time, those observations become internalized truths. Christine Brown's household, already functioning with her as the primary emotional anchor, began to feel even more self-contained. The stability that Christine provided became the most predictable structure in Truly's life. School routines, daily interactions, emotional regulation, all of it increasingly flowed through one consistent parent. Meanwhile, Kody's presence, while still real, became more variable in emotional tone and availability. Not necessarily absent in physical terms, but less anchored in the day-to-day rhythm of Christine's children. And children don't experience roles. They experience access. A father is not defined by title in a child's mind. He is defined by repetition, by emotional responsiveness, by whether he feels like a safe constant or an occasional presence that arrives and leaves without predictability. As the family continued to stretch across multiple households and evolving relationships, that unpredictability became more noticeable. And slowly, without any single defining moment, a quiet emotional recalibration took place in Truly's world. She began to rely more heavily on what was consistent. She began to orient her emotional expectations around the parent who was always there. And she began, like many children in similar dynamics, to adjust her internal understanding of what father actually meant based not on definition, but on experience. This is where childhood adaptation becomes invisible to adults, but deeply formative for the child. Because nothing feels broken from the inside. It just feels normal. It feels like how things are. But normal does not always mean balanced. And in Truly's case, the emotional center of gravity was slowly shifting, not through conflict, but through repetition, structure, and the quiet reality of who was consistently present when life was simply happening. That shift would become far more visible later. But its foundation was already being laid. By the time the cracks in the Brown family structure became more visible on screen, the real fracture had already been forming for years beneath the surface. And at the center of that quiet unraveling was Kody Brown stepping into a role she never officially chose, but increasingly had to embody: the primary emotional and practical parent for her children, including Truly. Kody's shift wasn't dramatic in a single moment. It was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The kind of shift that only becomes obvious when you look back across time and realize how much weight one person has been carrying alone. She was still part of a plural marriage in name, but in lived reality, her household was operating more and more like a single-parent environment. Decisions, routines, emotional support systems, daily problem-solving, all of it flowed through her. And children don't analyze that shift intellectually. They absorb it. For Truly, this meant that stability became synonymous with one parent's presence. Not because she was told that, but because that's what life repeatedly demonstrated. When she needed comfort, it was Kody. When she needed structure, it was Kody. When she needed emotional regulation, it was Kody. And over time, that consistency becomes the emotional anchor a child builds their world around. Meanwhile, Kody Brown's connection to Kody's household became increasingly defined by distance, timing, and fragmentation. Not necessarily total absence, but a growing lack of integration into the everyday rhythm of his children's lives in that home. And this is where the emotional psychology of childhood becomes especially important. Children don't measure relationships in big, dramatic gestures. They measure them in continuity, in how quickly someone responds, in how reliably someone returns, in whether presence feels predictable or conditional. So when that predictability weakens, children adjust, not consciously, but instinctively. They begin to lower expectations. They begin to rely less on the inconsistent presence. They begin to build emotional security around what is stable instead. And for Truly, that stable center was becoming increasingly clear. Kody was not just her mother in a biological sense, she was becoming her full emotional environment. This is also where Kody's growing independence from Kody becomes a critical turning point in the story. Because independence in a parent doesn't just change their own life, it reshapes the entire emotional ecosystem their children live inside. Kody began making decisions more autonomously. Her identity outside of the marriage became more defined. Her emotional tone shifted from endurance to clarity. And in that shift, the household itself started to feel different. Lighter in some ways, more direct in others, but most importantly, more consistent. And consistency is what children trust most. Without needing to say anything out loud, Truly began to live in a world where one parent felt like the constant, and the other increasingly felt like an external presence, someone who came into the orbit of her life, rather than someone who anchored it. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because over time, it shapes not just attachment, but expectation. And once expectation changes, relationship dynamics change with it. This is the point where the story stops being about who is technically present and starts becoming about something much deeper. Who Truly actually experiences as her father. And that answer, forming slowly over years rather than moments, was beginning to shift in a direction that no one fully acknowledged at the time, but would become impossible to ignore later. By this stage in the Brown family timeline, something important had already happened, even if no one explicitly named it in real time. The family hadn't just grown, it had reorganized itself emotionally. And that reorganization created visible differences in how children experienced the same father in different households. Kody Brown was still Kody Brown. Same man, same identity, same public role in the family narrative. But identity in a plural family system doesn't guarantee uniform experience. It never has. Because children don't relate to the family system. They relate to the version of a parent they personally receive. And those versions were no longer identical. In Kody's household, the emotional structure was becoming increasingly stable under her sole guidance. Predictability, routine, and direct emotional responsibility were centered in one place. That kind of environment creates clarity for children, even during transitions. But in other parts of the family system, the emotional center of gravity was being pulled in different directions. Not necessarily through intention alone, but through the reality of divided time, competing obligations, and shifting relational priorities. And children like Kody Brown, observant but not yet equipped with adult interpretation, experience that as difference in feeling, not explanation. They notice tone before reasoning, presence before justification, consistency before intent. And over time, those small differences accumulate into a recognizable emotional pattern. For truly, interactions with Kody began to feel increasingly situational rather than foundational. Not absent, not erased, but less structurally embedded in her everyday life. He was still her father. That never changed on paper. But in lived experience, his role became more dependent on timing, context, and which household reality he was stepping into at any given moment. And that is where emotional separation begins long before physical separation ever becomes official. Because a child does not experience relationships in compartments. They experience them as a whole emotional picture. And when that picture becomes inconsistent, the brain adapts by reorganizing expectations. Less anticipation, less dependency, more emotional self-reliance. This is not a conscious decision in a child's mind. It is adaptation. At the same time, Kody's own focus and emotional energy were increasingly spread across a complex and strained family structure that required constant negotiation between multiple adult relationships and household dynamics. That kind of environment naturally reduces the depth of one-on-one connection with individual children unless it is actively maintained with discipline and intention. And maintenance is where things often begin to slip, not in love, but in execution. So what develops is a subtle but important gap, the difference between being a father in theory and being a father in daily emotional practice. Kody Brown was growing up in that gap. And as that gap widened, her internal reference point for stability continued to shift toward the one parent whose presence was consistent without rotation or fragmentation. Christine became not just the primary caregiver, but the emotional default. The person her life organized itself around without needing to think about it. And every time consistency wins over inconsistency in a child's lived experience, attachment naturally follows. Not loudly. Not dramatically, but steadily. And in that steady shift, a quiet truth was forming in the background of Kody's childhood, one that would only become fully visible years later when the structure of the family had already changed beyond repair. When the separation between Christine Brown and Kody Brown became public, it looked like a headline to the outside world. A storyline. A reality TV turning point. Another major shift in a long-running family saga. But for Kody Brown, it wasn't a headline. It was a restructuring of her entire emotional world. Because adults experience separation through language, agreements, and explanations. Children experience it through changes in presence, routine, and emotional access. And those changes don't arrive all at once, they arrive in layers. First, there is the shift in atmosphere. Conversations become more direct. Tension becomes more defined. The emotional uncertainty that had been building over years stops being subtle and becomes visible. Then comes the structural change. Households stop operating under the same assumption of unity. Schedules change. Access changes. Expectations change. And finally, there is the emotional realization that what once felt like a family system is now clearly divided into separate lives. For Kody, this transition didn't introduce a brand new absence. It clarified an absence that had already been developing over time. Because by the time separation becomes official, children have often already adapted internally. They have already adjusted expectations. They have already recalibrated emotional dependency. They have already identified where consistency lives. And in Kody's case, that consistency had long been centered in Christine's household. So when the separation happened, the biggest emotional shift was not the loss of something stable, but the confirmation of what had already become true in practice. Kody Brown's role in Christine's household changed structurally after the separation. Access became more defined. Interaction became more scheduled. The informal flow of presence that sometimes characterizes earlier family systems gave way to clearer boundaries. And boundaries, while necessary for adults, also reshape how children experience emotional connection. For Truly, this meant that her interactions with her biological father became even more distinct from her day-to-day emotional environment. Less integrated, less embedded, more compartmentalized. At the same time, Christine's household became even more self-contained. The emotional ecosystem tightened around the people physically and consistently present. Stability became not just a feeling, but a structure. And in that structure, Truly's sense of home became more clearly defined than ever before. This is also the stage where children begin to form lasting interpretations of relationships, not based on singular moments, but on cumulative experience. Who was there during ordinary days? Who stayed consistent during change? Who remained emotionally accessible when life shifted? These are the questions that quietly shape long-term emotional memory. And the answers, in Truly's lived experience, were becoming increasingly weighted toward one side of her life. Meanwhile, Kody's public narrative continued to evolve in response to the broader family changes. But for children, narratives matter far less than direct experience. A child does not evaluate explanations about why something changed. They evaluate what is happening now. And what was happening now was a more defined separation between households, roles, and emotional accessibility. So the question that had been forming quietly for years, about what a father actually is in practice versus theory, was no longer abstract. It was becoming visible. Not through one dramatic confrontation, but through the simple reality of daily life settling into a new normal. And that new normal would set the stage for the most important shift of all. Not the separation itself, but what came after it. After the separation, something subtle but deeply important began to change inside Christine Brown's world. Not in a dramatic, headline-driven way, but in the quieter reality of rebuilding a life from structure outward. Because when a long-term emotional system breaks apart, what replaces it is not just new relationships or new routines. It is a completely new definition of stability. And that definition matters most for the children. For Truly Brown, life after separation was not about losing a father in a sudden emotional rupture. That part of her story had already been developing over time. Instead, what she experienced was the solidification of a different kind of home environment, one where consistency was no longer divided across multiple emotional systems, but concentrated in one. Christine became the central anchor even more clearly than before. The household rhythm stabilized around her presence in a way that was no longer influenced by the rotation of a plural structure. There was less unpredictability, less emotional fragmentation, and more direct continuity in daily life. And children feel that immediately, even if they cannot articulate it. They don't say, "This environment is more stable." They simply relax in it. That emotional relaxation is important because it creates space for something else to enter a child's life. New trust. Not forced trust. Not declared trust. Earned trust. That is where David Woolley enters the picture. When David became part of Christine's life, he did not enter as a replacement for anything or anyone. He entered into an already existing family system that had been reshaped by years of change. And that distinction is critical because blended family dynamics succeed or fail based on timing, tone, and approach, not titles. From what is publicly observable in behavior and family interaction, David's role developed gradually, not aggressively. He did not position himself as an authority figure trying to overwrite history. He stepped into the environment as a consistent adult presence, allowing relationships to form at a natural pace. And for a child like Truly, that difference is not small. Children do not respond to intention alone. They respond to emotional safety signals. They respond to tone of voice, patience, reaction consistency, and the absence of volatility. What begins to matter is not what a person claims to be, but how predictably they behave over time. In a household that had already undergone emotional turbulence through years of division and transition, predictability becomes powerful. It becomes grounding. And grounding is the foundation of attachment. Over time, David's presence in Christine's household created a different kind of dynamic for Truly, one where adult interaction was not filtered through conflict, inconsistency, or emotional unpredictability tied to a larger, fragmented system. Instead, it was steady, low pressure, present. That doesn't create instant attachment in a dramatic sense. It creates something more important: comfort. Comfort is the beginning of trust. And trust, once established in childhood, becomes part of how a child interprets safety in the world. So while the outside narrative often focuses on new relationships or new beginnings, what is actually happening at the ground level is far more subtle. A child is learning what stability feels like when it is not divided. And that learning begins to reshape everything they understand about the adults around them, especially the difference between presence that is consistent and presence that is conditional. By the time Kody Brown had fully rebuilt her life in Utah and settled into a new family structure, the contrast between two different kinds of presence in Truly Brown's world had become increasingly clear, not through words, but through experience. Because children don't measure relationships by labels. They measure them by patterns. And patterns had now fully formed. On one side was Kody Brown, a biological father whose role, after separation, became more defined by distance, scheduling, and emotional compartmentalization. His presence existed, but it was no longer woven into the everyday fabric of Truly's life in the same way it once was. This is not about erasing him from the story. It is about recognizing how presence changes meaning when it is no longer consistent. For Truly, interactions with Kody were no longer part of a continuous daily rhythm. They became events. Moments that happened within boundaries rather than flowing naturally through everyday life. And when connection becomes episodic, emotional reliance naturally decreases. Not because love disappears, but because predictability does. On the other side of her life was a very different pattern forming in Christine's household with David Woolley present. Here, the defining characteristic was consistency without fluctuation. No emotional unpredictability tied to larger family conflict. No shifting household priorities across multiple systems. No divided attention structure pulling focus in competing directions. Instead, there was continuity. And continuity is what allows trust to deepen over time without effort. For a child, this difference is not theoretical. It is felt in small moments. Who is calm during stress? Who responds without emotional volatility? Who remains present without needing to be scheduled into life? Who feels safe to approach without hesitation? These are not dramatic markers. They are behavioral constants. And over time, they build an emotional baseline. Truly Brown, growing through her teenage years in this environment, began to experience that baseline shift in a very real way. Her day-to-day emotional world was no longer divided between competing household energies. It was centered in one environment that provided stability and one external relationship that existed at a greater distance. And that separation matters. Because when a child no longer relies on a parent for daily emotional grounding, that parent's role naturally evolves in their internal world. Not into something meaningless, but into something different. Less foundational. More situational. Meanwhile, the consistent presence in her home environment became more influential in shaping her understanding of what family stability actually looks like in practice. This is where perception begins to solidify into long-term memory. Because children don't just remember events, they remember emotional climates. And emotional climates are defined by repetition. Over time, David's role in Christine's household became associated with that repetition. Calm interactions, steady presence, and a predictable environment where emotional safety did not need to be questioned. At the same time, Kody's presence, while still real and still part of Truly's life, existed in a different emotional category, one shaped by distance and defined moments rather than daily continuity. And this duality creates a psychological split in how children process relationships. One figure represents consistency of environment. The other represents connection through intervals. And as children grow, that distinction becomes more meaningful in shaping how they define closeness itself. Without any dramatic declaration, Truly's understanding of fatherhood was evolving. Not based on title, not based on biology, but based on lived emotional reality. And that is where the story begins to move toward its most defining question. What does father mean when two completely different experiences compete for that definition? By the time you reach the end of the story, the loudest moments are no longer the most important ones. There are no dramatic confrontations left to analyze, no single event that defines everything. Instead, what remains is something quieter and far more permanent. A child growing up. That is where Truly Brown is now in this narrative. Not at a breaking point. Not at a single defining scene. But at the long, ongoing process of forming identity from experience. Because childhood does not remember speeches. It remembers consistency. And over time, consistency becomes definition. On one side of her life stands Kody Brown, her biological father. A man whose presence is real, whose connection is undeniable in origin, but whose role in her daily emotional world has become less structurally central than it once was. Their relationship, as it exists in the post-separation reality, is shaped more by intervals than by continuity. Moments of connection exist, but they do not define the rhythm of her everyday life. And that matters more than people often realize. Because children do not measure love in intention. They measure it in availability. On the other side of her life is Christine Brown's household, rebuilt and restructured after years of emotional complexity. In that environment, consistency is no longer divided across multiple systems. It is centralized, stable, predictable. And within that stability is David Woolley. Not introduced as a replacement for anything, not framed as a corrective to the past, but present in a way that is fundamentally different from what came before, steady, patient, and consistently involved in the day-to-day rhythm of family life. For a child, that kind of presence does something important. It lowers emotional alertness. It removes the need to constantly interpret moods or predict reactions. It creates a sense of safety that does not fluctuate based on external dynamics. And over time, that becomes the environment in which identity forms. So when we step back and ask the question that opened this entire conversation, what does fatherhood actually mean in Truly Brown's life? The answer is no longer abstract. It is lived. Biology placed one man in that role. Experience placed another kind of presence alongside it. And childhood, as it always does, aligned itself with consistency. That does not erase history. It does not rewrite origin. But it does define impact. And impact is what children carry forward. Kody Brown's legacy in Truly's life is not a single moment or a single decision. It is the accumulation of years of divided attention, shifting priorities, and emotional inconsistency within a complex family system. A legacy that exists, whether acknowledged or not, in how a child learns to interpret presence versus absence. David Woolley's role, in contrast, is defined not by narrative positioning, but by daily behavior, by the quieter, less televised reality of showing up consistently in a blended family structure and allowing trust to develop at its own pace. And Christine Brown stands at the center of it all, not as a supporting character, but as the constant that held everything together long enough for stability to return. So where does that leave Truly? It leaves her in a place many children eventually reach in complex family systems, understanding that family is not defined by one definition alone. It is defined by experience layered over time. Some bonds are biological, some are structural, some are earned through presence. And as she grows, her understanding of those differences will continue to deepen. But the foundation of her story, the part that will always remain, is simple. A child does not choose who is called a father. A child learns who feels like one. And that is the truth this entire story has been building toward.